government since the Vichy regime, the collaborators with the Nazis, and of a party which was founded by some of those collaborators with the Nazis. We think there are very, very important lessons for Ireland in how the left was able to surge, was able to win the elections through the New Popular Front. They won by putting forward a radical programme, including wealth taxes, increases in the minimum wage, ecological planning, a full arms embargo and sanctions on Israel, and a whole detailed and radical programme that inspired people. The left came together in one alliance to offer, real change of life to ordinary people who may have thought about voting for the pseudo anti-establishment forces of Le Pen. They said clearly we are absolutely opposed to the neoliberalism of Macron and opposed to the hard right of Le Pen, and on that basis they were able to win a very, very important victory that I think will give people hope right across Europe in particular, where obviously the hard right is on the march. We think there are real lessons for us in Ireland, in particular looking to the next elections. So the opinion polls at the weekend, in line with the results of the local and European elections, would unfortunately say that we're currently on a trajectory to a return of a Fianna Fáil-Fine Gael government, probably with the Greens replaced by some form of right-wing independence or perhaps the Labour Party. We think that would be an absolute disaster. It would be a missed opportunity in terms of where the polls have been at for most of the period since the last general election, and we think there's lessons to learn from France. On that basis, we've written to Mary Lou MacDonald. We're seeking a meeting with Sinn Féin to appeal to Sinn Féin and others on the left to come together to learn from what has happened in France, to establish a left front here to go into the next election. Obviously, we have a different electoral system than in France. In France, it's single member seats, so you need to have one common candidate in each constituency. That isn't the case here. But what a left front would look like in Ireland is a clear vote left, transfer left, official pact between parties, is a common radical programme like they have in France, and is a common commitment to say to the people that we're not going to go into coalition with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. We offer the opportunity for a left government in this country for the first time in over 100 years of breaking the cycle of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael rule, and we think that has the potential to inspire hope, to inspire the chance that here is a chance for real change. That's what happened in the last general election. The last general election was a very dynamic thing because people thought, okay, now we have the chance for change. We have to put that chance for change back on the agenda, and we think the best way of doing so is by forming such a left front. Second point I want to make briefly is just about the latest EPA figures. These are being spun as a success for the government, but the truth is, unfortunately, they're not a success. The truth is that they show that we're still miles and miles and miles off our targets. We're on a trajectory to miss our emissions targets reductions by 2030, by the end of 2025, by a country mile. I mean, really. We're faced with, on top of that, what that means in terms of the disaster for our climate, it means fines or penalties of about €5 billion, the cost of maybe 2 children's hospital. That's the consequences of inaction. There's some interesting figures if you get into the different sectors. One is that agriculture is now responsible for almost 40% of all of our emissions, and that transport is actually continues to increase the amount of emissions because of the increase in private journeys. For us, that underlines the need, one, free public transport, get people out of cars, massively expand public transport. 2, we need a different agricultural model which serves the interests of our environment, protects biodiversity, and protects the interests of small farmers as opposed to the big dairy farmers and big agribusiness. And thirdly, I would just make the point in the context of the data centre discussion. I mean, there's a new data centre coming down the road from Google, which from one data centre, we've almost 100 data centres in this country, one data centre alone is going to be responsible for 0.5% of all of our carbon emissions in any given year. It's an incredible amount that we're choosing to say, oh, we're going to let them do that. We have to say no to big tech big data centres, and this drive, which is going to increase and increase and increase as a result of this turn to AI, is an absolute disaster from the point of view of our environment. And we have to say as a society, no, our environment takes precedence, getting people into public transport takes precedence, electrifying our economy takes precedence, as opposed to allowing big tech to use all of our carbon budget effectively.
Do you want to ask some questions?
Yeah, I'll ask you about the alliance for the vote left. First of all, does that include solidarity, which traditionally has had the suspicion that maybe Sinn Féin isn't quite as left as it should and veers more towards ethno-nationalism than true socialism? Two, are you going to include the Labour Party? And is it not time for PPP to get off that horse of the past decade saying they can't be part of any alliance? And three, how can you be calling for an alliance when you had in the European elections Claire Daly, a clear left candidate, and PPP stood against her and she lost her seat?
Yeah, so we think we need to sit down with the different parties of the left that people are voting for left-wing reasons, and to try to form a common left front. I mean, what was very, very impressive in France was that Macron called this snap election partly because he thought he would catch the left off guard, they wouldn't be able to pull together in time. That was all the media commentary. And in the space of a couple of days, they hammered out a programme, they hammered out a common platform. So we think that's what we need to do, and those that are willing to agree to such a platform, in our opinion, can be part of that left front. For us, there are some bottom lines. One bottom line is that no coalition with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. I think, people's disappointment and cynicism about politics is a big part of that comes from the fact that in the past they voted for change, for example for the Greens or for the Labour Party, and their votes have ended up putting Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael back in power. So we think this time people need to get a clear idea, okay, if I vote for these parties, I'll get them if they win, and I won't end up with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. We need to give people a clear choice. Secondly, I think there does need to be a clear commitment not to engage in any scapegoating of asylum seekers. I think if you look at the way that the new Popular Front in France addressed this issue, it is actually it shows what needs to be done, is to reject the framing that asylum seekers are the problem and to say no, the government is the problem, an economic system that prioritises profit is the problem. So to stand in solidarity with asylum seekers and to try and unite people from, regardless of what colour they are, regardless of what country they come from, against those who are actually responsible for the housing crisis, for the health crisis, i.e. the big corporate developers, the private landlords and the government. And thirdly, in terms of the European Parliament was a multi-seat constituency. There are going to be multiple seat constituencies, obviously, for the general election. We're not saying that in order to be part of this front, that anyone, say where I'm standing in Dublin South West, that anyone else would have to commit not to stand. Obviously, parties will still exist, will still have their own programmes, will still put forward their own ideas, but the key thing is to have clear transfer pacts between those parties and a common commitment to say we won't go into coalition with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, and here's the alternative.
Well, what about egos? Who's your leader, who's your spokesperson, who gets the speaking time of the Dáil? You're going to be dealing with a lot of egos there trying to hammer that out.
Well, I don't think so. I think that the key thing is to sit down, to develop a left front, like they've done in France. There are tensions between the different parties, between the PS, for example, and France Insoumise, no question about it, but they managed to put aside some of those things to come up with a common programme quite quickly, to put that before the people, and then to come first in the elections. So I think that's what we need to do here. In terms of speaking arrangements and so on, again, this is all subject to discussion, assuming that others are interested. From our perspective, we wouldn't see this as a formal, a registered political party. People Before Profit, Solidarity would still exist, Sinn Féin would still exist, the Soc Dems would still exist, Independence would still exist. And so that's how speaking arrangements will be organised in the next Dáil. But it's a question of coming together for the elections and saying we're standing as a common left front, we're urging people to transfer to each other, and we promise not to go in Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, and instead to form a left government.
Just on the second point that you made, Paul, with regard to scapegoating of migrants, I think it was, does Sinn Féin's rhetoric around migration, immigration, give you any pause for thought in the last few months, particularly with reference to their foregrounding of the issue of quote unquote open borders? Is that the kind of rhetoric that you think would actually disbar them from involvement in this common platform that you're talking about?
So I think Sinn Féin made a very, very big mistake, both morally and politically, in the run-up to the election. whereby instead of, when the government centred the issue of asylum seekers and said we're going to crack down on Ukrainians, we're going to reduce the amount of money they get, unfortunately, instead of saying, wait a minute, going after poor women and children and driving more and more people into poverty is not going to make a single extra home for an Irish person, a single extra hospital bed. Instead of standing clearly against that, unfortunately, they said, yes, we agree, and we'd go even further, we'd take their medical cards off them. There was other examples of things like that. I mean, we criticised them at the time. We think it is a serious moral failure, but also a strategic failure, and we think it absolutely backfires in the elections.
Would they back away from all that to part of your platform?
Well,
it's written to them.
Exactly.
Yes. So obviously it doesn't debar them.
Well, we want to have this discussion and see would they sign up to saying no scapegoating of asylum seekers.
Do you think they've scapegoated asylum seekers?
I think that there are now discussions happening within Sinn Féin reflecting on the disastrous local elections that they had.
Do you think they've scapegoated?
I think they've, I think they have
so by that merit then they wouldn't be allowed in the party. It's not your party, your platform.
Well, see, this is about going to what we can present for the next general election. And I think there's lots of people within Sinn Féin who know that what they did in the run-up to the local European election was an absolute disaster because they ended up playing the election on the pitch that the government wanted to play it on. The government didn't want to play it on the issue of housing, on the issue of healthcare, on the issue of climate crisis. They wanted the government to present themselves as we're the hard ones on migration. And unfortunately, Sinn Féin engaged in competition with them there. And I think there's a lot of people in Sinn Féin who are reflecting on that, realising that that didn't work, realising that was a mistake. And so we certainly hope would be open to, we need a different strategy more in line with what the New Popular Front did in France.
It's not a bit messy. Like, I think people at the moment know Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael are in government, and if this left is in government, it's kind of like there's a whole heap of people, no real leader. It might just be a bit messy.
I mean, I don't care if it's messy. For me, it's a question of we've had 100 years of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael running this country. We have 4,000 children living in hotel rooms. We're absolutely failing in terms of climate and biodiversity. We have 1 million people on hospital waiting lists. And if Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are returned, all that's going to get worse. Because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael don't just have wrong policies, they represent those that get rich from those crises. They represent big agribusiness, which is getting rich from the climate crisis. They represent the developers and private landlords who are getting rich from the housing crisis. They represent the private health industry that gets rich from the health crisis. So we need a government that represents ordinary people. In this political system that we have in Ireland, that would be a coalition government of multiple parties. No one party is going to be able to do it. But I think, like, up until recently, in a forced choice opinion poll, the majority of people, when forced with a choice of kind of left, Sinn Féin-led left coalition or Fianna Fáil Fine Gael government, a majority up until recently would have chosen the Sinn Féin-led left coalition. In the most recent polls, that's down quite substantially, and we think that reflects some of the mistakes made by others during the elections, and that's why we're trying to redevelop that momentum behind the idea of a left government. Right, you in brief?
Yeah. I just want to talk about the opportunity we have this week to go back to the question of Palestine and to point out to the government that despite all the talk, they have actually done nothing in relation to making the Israeli government stop the genocide in Palestine. There's a really startling article in The Lancet this week, which all of you as trained journalists will know is a very reputable magazine in the health sector. And The Lancet research points out that in reality, instead of the death toll being around 40,000 in Gaza, it could be up to 180,000. And the way that's calculated is, for example, by February of this year, more than 30% of all buildings in Gaza were flattened, and that rubble has never been touched. And it is estimated that under that rubble at least 10,000 people lie dead, and their bodies have not been counted by the Gazan health authorities, who only count what comes into the hospital, what dies in the hospital, and what bodies people and medics, etc. And crucially, the UNHCR tell them about. Their funding has been cut, and the loss of their input is a big part of this. The other thing is that deaths, even as we speak, that aren't directly connected to bombings or to ambushes or shootings or phosphorus being dropped or buildings falling on kids' heads, deaths are happening anyway. A lot of them now through famine, a lot of them through disease, a lot of them through trauma, and the estimates that they give is based on a scientific study of previous wars and how much unseen deaths are actually unaccounted for until it's all done and dusted. So that really increases the urgency for this government to stop talking, stop making nice pronouncements like we recognise the state of Palestine, we will support the case in the Human Rights Court in Amsterdam. Very good, thank you. Fly the flag for one day, very good, thank you. But actually do something like, for example, let the Occupied Territories bill pass. They've been holding that back. And impose real sanctions on Israel. Stop trading with them, go to the European Union and demand that there's real sanctions imposed on them, and expel the Israeli ambassador, because all the time we're being told for diplomatic reasons that's not possible, but it has done absolutely nothing to halt the genocide. In fact, from a personal observation, I think this genocide is being normalised across the world and is hardly being talked about in the mainstream media. That's not putting any fault on you guys, but it is not being talked about in the mainstream media. And 2 nights ago we had the most and the worst bombing ever in the whole 9 months on the people of Gaza. They literally rained down the bombs. So we want to say to the government this week, before you come out of office, before you call an election, we think it's going to be earlier rather than later, actually do something about genocide and not just talk about it, because they'll try to put themselves down in history as trying their best to end the genocide, to deal with this horrific war and famine in Gaza, but actually they haven't done a thing. And so that's going to be our message to them this week before we close the shop.